The Texan Bar was a chocolate bar that Roundtree's launched in the early 70s, and if you ever had one, you'll remember it for one very specific reason: it was ridiculously chewy. This thing combined nougat and toffee under a milk chocolate coating, but the real selling point was the texture. It wasn't just chewy in the normal sense. It was the kind of chewy where you'd bite off a piece and your jaw would genuinely get tired working through it. Some people kept them in the fridge, which made them harder, like a workout for your teeth. The bar was decent sized too, so it lasted a while, partly because you physically couldn't eat it quickly, even if you wanted to. The advertising campaign was brilliant and became just as famous as the bar itself. They ran these adverts featuring a cowboy who'd end up in dangerous situations, tied to a stake about to be burned, facing a firing squad, that sort of thing. Right before the moment of doom, he'd ask for a Texan bar as a last request. Then he'd stand there calmly chewing while his captors waited and eventually fell asleep or gave up from exhaustion. The whole joke was that the bar took so long to chew, he'd outlast them. The catchphrase was "sure is a mighty chew," which pretty much summed it up perfectly. Another version went, "someone should have told him. Texan takes time a chewin'." Roundtree's discontinued the Texan in 1984 for reasons that were never properly explained. It stayed gone for decades until Nestlé brought it back briefly as a limited nostalgia edition. That didn't last long though. Customers voted the Texan their favorite sweet of all time by a massive margin, which makes its disappearance even stranger. Spangles were these square-shaped boiled sweets with rounded edges that Mars Limited made in the UK from 1950 all the way through to 1984. Each sweet had a little circular dimple pressed into both sides, which gave them this distinctive look you could spot straight away. They came wrapped in a striped paper tube, bright orange-red alternating with silver, and the sweets themselves were translucent and fruit-flavored. The regular packet had strawberry, blackcurrant, orange, pineapple, lemon and lime, and cola all mixed together. Originally, they weren't individually wrapped, just rattling around loose in the tube, but later on, Mars started wrapping each one in cellophane. Here's the thing that made Spangles proper popular when they first launched. Sweets were still rationed in Britain back then because of the war. Most sweets and chocolate cost you 2 points from your ration book, but Spangles only needed 1 point. That made them brilliant value if you had a sweet tooth and didn't want to burn through all your tokens. Mars knew they were onto something good and hired American actor William Boyd, who played Hopalong Cassidy in films, to advertise them with the slogan, "Hoppy's favorite sweet." Over the years, Mars introduced loads of single-flavor varieties: barley sugar, acid drop, peppermint, spearmint, licorice, tangerine. There was even an Old English version with traditional flavors like mint humbug, pear drop, aniseed, and treacle. Sales stayed strong through the 70s, but by the early 80s they dropped off enough that Mars pulled them in 1984. They brought them back briefly in 1995, selling them in Woolworths with just 4 flavors available, but it didn't stick. These days, Spangles are so linked with post-war Britain that there's this nostalgic phrase people use: "Do you remember Spangles?" Bongo was a tropical fruit juice drink that hit UK shelves in 1983 under the Libby's brand. The drink was packed with concentrated fruit juices including apple, lemon, orange, pineapple, passion fruit, mandarin, apricot, guava, and mango, giving it this sweet tropical kick. But what really made Bongo iconic was not the drink itself, but the animated TV advert that launched in 1985. The advert had this ridiculously catchy jingle that you could not get out of your head. You know the one. Way down deep in the middle of the Congo, a hippo took an apricot, a guava, and a mango. The whole thing featured cartoon animals dancing around in the jungle whilst explaining how Bongo got its name. Once you heard it, the jingle would loop in your head for days. The ironic thing is that despite the entire marketing campaign being centered around the Congo, Bongo was never actually sold or distributed there. Bongo dominated lunchboxes throughout the 80s and into the 90s until health concerns kicked in. Parents started worrying about sugar content and artificial ingredients in children's drinks, which led to new regulations in the early 2000s. The original formula was scrapped and replaced with a simplified version containing just oranges, bananas, and pineapples. This new version was absolutely not the same, and fans were not happy about it. Eventually, in 2009, the manufacturers gave in and brought back the proper version. You can still find Bongo in UK supermarkets today in 200 milliliter cartons. Trio was a chocolate biscuit bar that basically owned the 80s and early 90s when it came to kids' lunchboxes. Made first by Jacobs and later under the McVitie's brand, this bar had 3 distinct layers stacked together. That's where the name came from. You got a crunchy biscuit base on the bottom, then a layer of soft toffee cream in the middle, all covered in milk chocolate on the outside. The whole thing was split into 3 equal chunks so you could snap it apart easily. Most kids just bit straight through the lot, though. The chocolate coating was properly thick too, not the thin stuff you get on some bars. There was a strawberry-flavored version that came along at some point, but the original toffee one was always the favorite. What really made Trio stick in people's heads, though, was the advert. You had this animated girl called Susie with this massive voice belting out, "Trio, Trio, I want a trio and I want one now," to the tune of Day-O, the Banana Boat song. The animations were done by Bob Godfrey, who made rhubarb and custard. There was this hippie bloke with tom-tom drums and a sleepy ginger guitarist. In one version, they tried to shut Susie in a soundproof box because she was so loud. In another, they escaped to the Arctic, but she tracked them down anyway. Everyone at school used to sing the song constantly. The bar disappeared from shops in 2003 after a 20-year run. A Facebook campaign brought it back briefly in 2016, but it vanished again pretty quickly after that. In 1973, R. White's Lemonade launched what became one of the most memorable advertising campaigns in British television history. The ad itself was simple but brilliant. A man in striped pajamas creeps downstairs in the middle of the night to raid his fridge for a bottle of lemonade. The whole thing was set to a catchy jingle that went, "I'm a secret lemonade drinker," and you'd hear this bloke singing as he tiptoed around, trying not to wake the house. The man you saw on screen was an actor and mime called Julian Chagrin, but the voice belonged to someone else entirely. Ross McManus, who was a musician and happened to be the father of Elvis Costello. McManus wrote the song himself, and his teenage son, who'd later become famous as Elvis Costello, but was still just Declan McManus back then, provided the backing vocals. The campaign was created by Rod Allen, who came up with the secret lemonade drinker slogan, and it clearly struck a chord with people because it stayed on television for 11 straight years until 1984. The ad won a silver award at the 1974 International Advertising Festival and became so iconic that people still remember it decades later. White's itself was a carbonated lemonade drink, clear and sweet, produced by Britvic and sold across the UK. Throughout the 1980s, the brand enjoyed massive popularity thanks largely to this advertising campaign. Everyone knew the jingle and everyone had snuck downstairs for a midnight snack at some point, so the whole concept felt relatable. But by the 90s, the soft drinks market had become increasingly competitive, with big American brands dominating shelf space, and R. White's gradually lost ground. The brand never quite recaptured that 1980s peak, despite the campaign's enduring cultural impact. Pacers were these green and white striped mints that Mars made back in the 70s and 80s, sitting alongside their more famous cousin, Opal Fruits. Thing is, they didn't start out striped at all. Originally, they were called Opal Mints and were just plain white chewy squares with a spearmint flavour. Nothing special to look at, really. The company rebranded them as Pacers around 1976, and somewhere along the way, they added 3 green peppermint stripes to each sweet to give it that distinctive look you might remember from the wrapper. The advertising campaign was all about this 2-mint freshness idea, whatever that meant, and featured people doing sports in white clothes who'd pop a pacer in their mouth, and suddenly their kit would gain green stripes matching the sweet. The most memorable one had ice skaters gliding around a rink who'd look shocked when this happened, pointing at their newly striped tops like they'd just witnessed a miracle. One bloke literally just says the word stripes with this amazed expression, which even as a kid felt a bit daft. Despite the questionable adverts, the sweets themselves had a proper minty taste, quite strong really, almost like chewing on toothpaste, but in a good way if you were into that sort of thing. The Scottish football club Celtic got nicknamed the Pacers at one point because their green and white striped jerseys looked exactly like the sweet wrappers, which is quite a claim to fame for a mint. Mars discontinued them in 1990 5, and they're one of those retro sweets people still talk about wanting back, even though they only lasted about 9 years under that name. Fry's Five Boys was a milk chocolate bar that once dominated sweet shops across Britain before it vanished from shelves in 1976. The bar itself was divided into 5 segments. Each piece had one of the 5 faces actually stamped into the chocolate so you could see the expressions as you broke it apart. The wrapper showed the same 5 faces running across it with captions underneath. These read desperation, pacification, expectation, acclamation, and realization spelled with a Z. The idea was simple enough. The faces showed a boy going from desperate for chocolate to finally eating it and realizing it was a Fry's bar. These weren't 5 different boys though, just one lad photographed with 5 different expressions. His name was Lindsay Poulton, and he was 5 years old when the photos were taken back in 1885. His father and grandfather were photographers, and Fry's paid them 200 quid for exclusive rights to use the images, which was a massive sum at the time. The story gets a bit grim when you learn how they got the desperation shot. They put a cloth soaked in photographer's ammonia around the poor kid's neck to make him cry properly. Fry's launched the bar in 1902 for just 1 penny. It became hugely recognizable thanks to those faces appearing everywhere on enameled metal signs outside confectioners and on posters. The boy originally wore a sailor suit in the photos, but they updated his outfit to a striped jersey in 1935. Lindsay Poulton was still alive when journalists tracked him down in Rhode Island in the 1960s. He must have been quite surprised to find his childhood face still selling chocolate 7 decades later. Cremola Foam was a Scottish soft drink that came as coloured crystals in a wee tin, and when you mixed it with water, you got a bright, fizzy, foamy beverage that tasted completely artificial. It was absolutely beloved by generations of Scottish kids. The drink launched in May 1932 at a food exhibition in Aberdeen. It was made by Cremola Food Products in Glasgow, and it became a runaway success almost immediately. The original flavours were lemon, orange, and raspberry, though cola and lime got added later on. The tin itself was small and metal, with a tight lid you'd pry off with a teaspoon. Inside you'd find these bright crystals beneath a paper seal. The instructions were dead simple: add 2 teaspoons to cold water, stir and drink. What you got was synthetic in every sense, a drink with 0 actual fruit in it despite all the advertising chat about fresh fruit flavours. The ingredients list tells you everything you need to know. There was sugar and saccharin for sweetness, citric and tartaric acids for the sharp, fruity taste, sodium bicarbonate, which reacted with those acids to produce carbon dioxide and make it fizz. Saponin or extract of quillia created that foamy head on top like a pint of beer. Gum acacia thickened it slightly, and then artificial colours and flavours made it look and taste like raspberry or orange or whatever. The packaging claimed it made 10 big drinks per tin, and it was fully sweetened, so no messing about with adding sugar yourself. Nestlé killed it off in October 1998. The nostalgia for it among Scots is intense even now, with people paying serious money for vintage tins and modern recreations popping up, trying to capture that specific chemical taste. Banjo started life in the 1950s as a chocolate wafer bar sold around Greater London, basically a Kit Kat style thing with a chocolate filling covered in milk chocolate. That version got canned in 1944. Fast forward to 1966, and Mars brought it back with a proper telly campaign, completely redesigned this time. The new Banjo came as a twin bar packaged in a navy blue wrapper with bold yellow letters, and it looked a lot like a Twix from the outside, same shape and size. Inside, though, it was different. You had a crispy wafer base layered with a nutty caramel filling and a generous coating of chopped roasted peanuts, all wrapped up in milk chocolate. Think of it as Mars taking on Rowntree's Drifter, but throwing in that crunchy peanut layer to set it apart. The wrapper itself was one of the first British chocolate bars to use a heat-sealed closure instead of the folded back flap you'd normally see. There was also a coconut version floating about in a red wrapper with the same yellow text if peanuts weren't your thing. The advertising pushed that catchy slogan, "Banjo, play a tune you can chew," and it stuck in people's heads. In 1917, they even launched Banjo tea breaks, a miniature version sold in sharing bags. By the 80s, Mars tried tweaking it with an extra flavor variant priced at 14p, but it wasn't enough. Banjo vanished from the shelves somewhere around the mid-80s and never came back, despite years of nostalgia and Bring It Back campaigns. Tab Clear hit shelves in January 93, just weeks after Pepsi launched Crystal Pepsi in late 92. Coca-Cola unveiled it at a press event at the Hayden Planetarium in New York, presenting it as their entry into the clear cola craze sweeping through the soft drink industry. The drink was basically Tab, their existing Diet Cola from the 60s, but with all the color stripped out. It still had caffeine though, unlike Crystal Pepsi, and it was sugar-free and calorie-free from the start. Coca-Cola's president Doug Ivester called it a study in contradictions because it looked clear but tasted like cola. But here's the thing, Ivester and Chief Marketing Officer Sergio Zyman never actually expected Tab Clear to succeed. In fact, they designed it specifically to fail. The whole launch was a kamikaze marketing tactic aimed at destroying Crystal Pepsi. The logic went like this. Tab was already known as a diet drink, so making it clear would link clear cola with diet product in consumers' minds. When shoppers saw both Tab Clear and Crystal Pepsi on the shelf, they'd naturally assume Crystal Pepsi was also diet soda, even though it wasn't. Regular soda drinkers wouldn't want what they thought was a diet drink, which would tank sales. Zyman later admitted openly that Pepsi spent enormous amounts of money on Crystal Pepsi, and regardless, we killed it. Tab Clear rolled out in 10 American cities first and barely lasted a year. It worked perfectly as intended, taking Crystal Pepsi down with it.